In 1285, a common thief named William de Merton made the worst mistake of his life. He stole a loaf of bread and 3 silver coins from a merchant in London. What happened next wasn't a quick hanging or a simple beheading. No, William was about to experience something far worse. A punishment so calculated, so methodical, that it would take 3 full days to complete. And he would be conscious for most of it. This wasn't just execution. This was theater. This was warning. This was medieval England, showing the world what happened to those who dared steal from their betters. What you're about to hear will make you grateful you weren't born in the 13th century. Medieval England had a problem, a massive systemic problem that threatened the very fabric of society. Theft was everywhere. In a world where most people owned almost nothing, where a single cow could mean the difference between survival and starvation, stealing wasn't just a crime. It was an existential threat to the social order. The ruling class needed to make examples. They needed punishment so horrifying that even the most desperate peasant would think twice before taking something that wasn't theirs. And so they developed a system of execution that was designed not for efficiency, but for maximum suffering and maximum visibility. The goal wasn't just to kill thieves. It was to make them die slowly enough that everyone could watch, learn, and be terrified. When William was caught, his punishment began immediately, not with torture, but with humiliation. He was stripped completely naked in the town square, his hands bound behind his back with rough hemp rope that cut into his wrists. The crowd gathered quickly. Medieval people loved public punishments. It was free entertainment in a world with very little of it. William was forced to stand on a wooden platform while a town crier read out his crimes in excruciating detail. Every item he'd stolen, every law he'd broken. His family was often forced to attend, standing in the crowd, bearing the shame. This public shaming wasn't just psychological torture for William. It was a warning to his neighbors, his friends, his relatives. This is what happens when you step out of line. The first day of William's punishment was all about marking him permanently. If by some miracle he survived what was coming, everyone would need to know what he'd done. The executioner heated an iron brand in a coal fire until it glowed red-orange, almost white at the edges. The brand was shaped like a letter T for thief. When it was hot enough, 2 guards held William's right hand flat against a wooden block. The executioner pressed the brand into his palm, holding it there for a full 10 seconds. The smell of burning flesh mixed with William's screams. The pain was indescribable. 3rd-degree burns that destroyed nerve endings, muscle, and skin. But this was just the beginning. After the branding, William's hand was deliberately not treated. No bandages, no ointment. They wanted it to get infected. They wanted him to suffer through the night. After the branding, William wasn't taken to a cell. He was locked in the pillory in the center of town. The pillory was a wooden framework with holes for the head and hands, forcing the prisoner to stand bent over, unable to sit or lie down. William would spend the entire night in this position, his branded hand throbbing with pain, exposed to the elements. But the physical discomfort wasn't the worst part. Medieval crowds were vicious. Passers-by threw rotten vegetables, animal waste, even stones at prisoners in the pillory. Children were encouraged to participate. It was considered good moral education. William stood there for 16 hours straight, unable to sleep, unable to defend himself, his body covered in filth, his hand screaming in agony. And he knew this was only the first day. The second day began at dawn. William was released from the pillory and immediately tied to a wooden post in the same town square. His back was still bare from the previous day's humiliation. The executioner approached with a whip. Not a simple leather strap, but a cat o' 9 tails, a whip with 9 separate cords, each tipped with small metal barbs or knots. The law specified exactly how many lashes William would receive. For his crimes, it was 40. The executioner was a professional. He knew how to make each lash count, how to maximize pain without killing the prisoner too quickly. The first lash tore open William's skin. By the 10th, his back was a mess of open wounds. By the 20th, he'd lost consciousness twice and been revived with buckets of cold water. By the 40th, his back looked like raw meat. What most people don't understand about medieval whipping is how devastating it was to the human body. Each strike of the cat o' nine tails didn't just break the skin. The metal barbs tore through muscle, sometimes even reaching bone. Blood loss was significant. Many prisoners went into shock. But the executioners were skilled enough to know exactly how far they could go without killing the prisoner outright. They wanted William to survive to day 3. After the whipping, William's wounds were deliberately left untreated again. In the medieval mind, suffering was part of the punishment. Mercy was weakness. William was thrown into a filthy cell with a dirt floor, his back a battlefield of open wounds, perfect breeding ground for infection. He spent the second night in a state of semi-consciousness, delirious with pain and fever. Medieval authorities didn't see this prolonged torture as cruelty. They saw it as justice. The Church taught that physical suffering on earth could reduce suffering in purgatory. By torturing William's body, they believed they were actually helping his soul. This wasn't sadism for its own sake. It was sadism wrapped in religious righteousness, which made it even more terrifying. Priests would sometimes visit condemned prisoners between torture sessions, offering spiritual counsel, hearing confessions, promising that their suffering had meaning. Some prisoners actually thanked their torturers, convinced that 3 days of hell on earth was worth avoiding eternal damnation. This psychological manipulation was as much a part of the punishment as the physical torture. Break the body and the mind simultaneously. On the morning of the 3rd day, William could barely stand. His hand was infected, swollen to twice its normal size, streaked with red lines indicating sepsis spreading up his arm. His back was a horror show of infected lash marks, some showing early signs of gangrene. He'd lost significant weight from not eating, his body consuming itself to survive. But the authorities weren't done with him yet. William was dragged from his cell and forced to walk through the streets to the execution site outside the city walls. This journey was another part of the punishment. The condemned prisoner, broken and bloody, paraded through town as a final warning. Crowds lined the streets. Some threw more filth, others wept. Most just stared, grateful it wasn't them. The execution site was carefully chosen for maximum visibility. Usually a hill or raised ground where crowds could gather and watch from a distance. By the time William arrived, hundreds of people were already waiting. Executions were public holidays. Vendors sold food and ale. Children sat on their fathers' shoulders for a better view. This wasn't considered morbid or unusual. This was normal. This was justice. This was entertainment. A wooden gallows stood in the center of the site, but William wasn't going to be hanged in the traditional sense. The 3-day punishment for thieves had a specific final act, one that was designed to be both symbolically powerful and physically agonizing. William was about to experience something that modern people can barely comprehend. The full, hanging, drawing, and quartering punishment was typically reserved for traitors, but thieves received a modified version that was still horrifically brutal. William was forced to climb a ladder to the gallows platform. A noose was placed around his neck, but this wasn't designed to break his neck and kill him quickly. The rope was carefully measured so that when he was pushed off the platform, he would hang just long enough to begin suffocating, but not long enough to die. He would dangle there, conscious, strangling, his face turning purple, his eyes bulging, his body thrashing. After several minutes, just before death, he would be cut down. This partial hanging was designed to bring the prisoner to the very edge of death, to let them feel themselves dying, and then cruelly pull them back. Once William was cut down, barely conscious, he was laid on a wooden hurdle, a flat frame that could be dragged across the ground. This was the drawing part of the punishment. He was tied to the hurdle and dragged around the execution site, his mutilated back scraping across dirt and stones, reopening every wound from the previous day's whipping. The pain was indescribable. William screamed until his voice gave out, until he had no breath left to scream. The crowd watched in silence now. Even the most bloodthirsty spectators were beginning to feel uncomfortable. But the executioner wasn't done. Not even close. The worst part, the part that truly defined this 3-day torture, was still to come. And William, incredibly, was still conscious. For thieves specifically, the punishment included symbolic mutilation. William's right hand, the hand that had stolen, the hand that had been branded on day 1, was now going to be removed. Not quickly with an axe, but slowly with a saw. The executioner bound William's arm to a wooden block. The saw was dull, requiring multiple strokes to cut through flesh, muscle, tendon, and bone. This wasn't a clean medical amputation. This was butchery. William's screams reached a pitch that didn't sound human anymore. Blood poured from the wound. Medieval executioners had learned to apply hot tar to stumps to stop the bleeding, not to help the prisoner, but to keep them alive longer. They wanted William to see his own hand separated from his body. They wanted him to understand, viscerally, permanently, what theft cost. Only after the mutilation was William finally hanged properly. By this point he was barely alive, his body in severe shock from blood loss, pain, and infection. The noose was placed around his neck again, and this time he was hanged until dead. But even death didn't bring an end to the punishment. His body was left hanging from the gallows for days, sometimes weeks, as a warning to others. Crows would peck at the corpse. The body would bloat and decay. The smell was horrific, but medieval authorities wanted everyone who passed by to see what happened to thieves. The body became a landmark, a rotting monument to the power of the law. Eventually, when the body decomposed enough, it would fall, and the bones would be left scattered beneath the gallows as a permanent reminder. This 3-day punishment wasn't the invention of one sadistic lord. It was codified in English law. The Statute of Westminster of 1275, enacted under King Edward I, established specific punishments for specific crimes. Theft of goods worth more than 12 pence could result in death. But the method of execution was left to local authorities, and many chose the prolonged torture approach as a deterrent. Legal documents from the period show that these extended punishments were common, not exceptional. Court records from 13th and 14th century England detail hundreds of cases where thieves were subjected to multi-day torture before execution. This wasn't aberrant behavior by a few cruel individuals. This was state policy. This was the law. To understand why medieval England was so brutal toward thieves, you have to understand medieval economics. In a society where most people lived at subsistence level, theft could literally mean death for the victim. If a peasant family's only cow was stolen, they might starve over the winter. If a merchant lost their goods, they might go bankrupt. Property was everything because most people had almost nothing. The ruling class was terrified of social chaos, of a breakdown in the hierarchy that kept them in power. Harsh punishments for theft weren't just about justice, they were about control. They were about maintaining a system where the poor stayed poor and desperate, but not desperate enough to rebel. The 3-day punishment was a calculated tool of social engineering. Women convicted of theft faced equally horrific punishments, though sometimes with different methods. Female thieves were often subjected to the same branding and whipping, but instead of hanging, drawing, and quartering, they might be burned at the stake. The logic was that burning was more appropriate for women because it avoided the sexual exposure that came with hanging. Medieval authorities were concerned about preserving female modesty, even while torturing women to death. Women were stripped only to their undergarments, tied to a stake, and burned alive. The process could take over an hour if the executioner built the fire incorrectly. Some women would die from smoke inhalation before the flames reached them. Others weren't so lucky. The screams of burning women haunted medieval towns just as much as the sight of quartered men. The men who carried out these 3-day punishments were professionals. Being an executioner was a hereditary profession in medieval England, passed from father to son. Executioners were social pariahs, forced to live outside town walls, forbidden from entering churches, avoided by everyone. But they were also essential. They were paid well for their grim work. A skilled executioner knew exactly how to maximize suffering without killing the prisoner prematurely. They knew which cuts would bleed heavily but not fatally, how long someone could hang before brain death, how to revive an unconscious prisoner with cold water or smelling salts. This knowledge was carefully guarded and passed down through generations. Executioners took pride in their work, in their ability to make a 3-day punishment last exactly 3 days, no more, no less. The crowds who watched these executions were active participants, not passive observers. Medieval authorities encouraged public attendance at executions because they wanted the deterrent effect to be maximized. But something darker was happening too. People brought their children to watch thieves being tortured to death. They treated it as entertainment. They cheered when the executioner did something particularly brutal. This wasn't because medieval people were inherently more cruel than modern humans. It was because they'd been conditioned to see this violence as normal, as necessary, as righteous. The 3-day punishment worked as a deterrent not just because it was brutal, but because entire communities participated in and normalized that brutality. Everyone became complicit in the violence. Occasionally, against all odds, someone survived a 3-day punishment. Maybe the executioner made a mistake. Maybe the prisoner had an unusually strong constitution. Maybe divine intervention, as medieval people would have interpreted it. Those who survived were usually pardoned, as their survival was seen as a sign from God. But survival didn't mean escape. A thief who'd been branded, whipped, mutilated, and partially hanged would bear those scars for life. They would never work normally again. Their hand was gone. Their back was permanently damaged. They were marked forever as criminals. Most survivors became beggars, dependent on charity, living reminders of what happened when you broke the law. In a way, surviving was almost worse than dying. They became walking warnings, more effective than any executed corpse. The 3-day punishment for thieves didn't last forever. By the 15th century, England began moving toward quicker executions, not out of mercy, but out of efficiency. Hanging became standardized. The elaborate torture rituals were reserved for only the most serious crimes like treason. By the 16th century, reformers were arguing that prolonged torture was uncivilized, though executions themselves remained common. The shift wasn't about suddenly discovering human rights. It was about changing ideas of effective governance. Authorities realized that quick, certain punishment could be just as effective a deterrent as prolonged torture, and it required less resources, less time, and less public spectacle. The 3-day punishment faded, not because society became more compassionate, but because it became more efficient. The brutality didn't disappear. It just evolved. England wasn't unique in its brutality toward thieves. Across medieval Europe, theft was punished with horrific violence. In France, thieves might be broken on the wheel, their limbs shattered one by one with an iron bar until they died from shock. In Germany, they practiced a punishment called Säcken, where thieves were sewn into a sack with a dog, a rooster, a snake, and a monkey, then thrown into a river. The animals, panicking as they drowned, would tear the thief apart inside the sack. In Italy, thieves might be blinded or have their noses and ears cut off, marked forever as criminals. Each culture developed its own signature tortures, but the underlying logic was always the same. Theft threatens social order, and social order must be maintained through terror. Medieval Europe was unified in its commitment to making thieves suffer spectacularly. Living in a society where 3-day torture executions were normal had profound psychological effects on medieval people. Children who watched these punishments grew up accepting violence as a natural part of justice. The constant presence of executed bodies, hanging from gallows or displayed in cages, created an atmosphere of perpetual fear. But it also created a strange form of community bonding. Attending executions together was a shared social experience. People talked about particularly brutal executions for years afterward. Executioners became minor celebrities. The spectacle of suffering became woven into the fabric of daily life. Modern psychologists would recognize this as a form of mass traumatization and desensitization, but medieval people had no framework for understanding what constant exposure to state-sanctioned torture was doing to their collective psyche. They just accepted it as normal. One crucial detail about the 3-day punishment: it was almost never used on nobility. If a lord or knight was convicted of theft, they might be imprisoned, fined, or at worst, beheaded quickly. The prolonged torture was reserved exclusively for commoners. This wasn't just about practical class privilege. It reflected medieval beliefs about the nature of nobility. The upper classes were thought to have literally different blood, finer physical constitutions that deserved better treatment. Torturing a nobleman was considered almost sacrilegious, a violation of natural order. But torturing a peasant thief was seen as appropriate, even necessary. The same crime received radically different punishments based entirely on the criminal's social status. This double standard was openly acknowledged and legally codified. Justice wasn't blind in medieval England. It was explicitly, deliberately, systematically biased in favor of the powerful. The church played a complex role in these 3-day punishments. On one hand, priests would minister to condemned prisoners, offering last rites and spiritual comfort. On the other hand, the church actively supported the punishment system. Bishops and abbots sat on the courts that sentenced thieves to torture. Monasteries and churches displayed the bodies of executed criminals on their grounds as warnings. Some religious orders even provided executioners. The church taught that earthly suffering was temporary, but sin was eternal, so better to suffer 3 days on earth than eternity in hell. This theological justification allowed medieval Christians to reconcile their faith's teachings about mercy and compassion with their enthusiastic participation in systematic torture. God's justice, they believed, sometimes required earthly brutality. The executioner was doing God's work. Historical records preserve specific names and details of people who underwent the 3-day punishment. In 1305, a man named Robert Leclerc was subjected to the full treatment in Norwich for stealing a horse. Court documents detail each stage of his punishment, noting the times and methods used. In 1323, a woman named Alice de Sheen was burned after a 3-day public humiliation in London for stealing jewels from her employer. In 1348, during the Black Death, theft became so common that authorities accelerated executions, but still maintained the 3-day framework whenever possible. These weren't abstract policies. These were real human beings with names, families, stories. Each one of them experienced unimaginable suffering because they took something that didn't belong to them. Their names survive in dusty court records, bureaucratic notations of human agony. The 3-day punishment might seem like ancient history, completely disconnected from modern justice systems, but its legacy persists in unexpected ways. The idea that punishment should be public and visible influenced criminal justice philosophy for centuries. The concept of proportional punishment, where the severity should match the crime, has medieval roots. Even the modern debate about cruel and unusual punishment echoes arguments that began in the medieval period. When we discuss whether capital punishment is moral, whether prisons should focus on punishment or rehabilitation, whether public shaming is acceptable, we're continuing conversations that began when medieval people watched thieves being tortured for 3 days. The specifics have changed dramatically, but the fundamental questions about justice, vengeance, and deterrence remain eerily similar. We'd like to think we've evolved beyond medieval brutality. Sometimes I wonder if we've just gotten better at hiding it. Did the 3-day punishment actually work as a deterrent? The historical evidence is mixed. Theft remained common throughout the medieval period despite brutal punishments. Some historians argue this proves harsh penalties don't deter crime. Others argue that without these punishments, theft would have been even more widespread. The truth is probably complicated. For some potential thieves, the fear of torture was enough to keep them honest. For others, desperate enough or reckless enough, even the threat of 3 days of agony wasn't enough to stop them. What's certain is that medieval authorities believed in the deterrent effect, and that belief justified centuries of systematic torture. They created an entire machinery of suffering based on the assumption that making examples of thieves would reduce theft. Whether it actually worked was almost beside the point. The punishment had become an end in itself. Behind the statistics and legal documents were individual human tragedies. William de Merton, our thief from the beginning, was probably desperate when he stole that bread and those coins. Maybe his family was starving. Maybe he was unemployed and saw no other option. We'll never know his motivations because history didn't care about them. All history recorded was his crime and his punishment. Multiply William by thousands, by tens of thousands, and you begin to grasp the scale of suffering involved in maintaining medieval England's justice system. Every person tortured for 3 days had a story, had people who loved them, had reasons for what they did. But medieval justice wasn't interested in stories or reasons or context. It was interested in maintaining order through fear, and it worked, at least well enough to keep the system functioning for centuries. The human cost was incalculable, but from the perspective of medieval authorities, it was a cost worth paying. The 3-day punishment for thieves in medieval England represents one of the darkest chapters in the history of criminal justice. It was systematic, legal, religiously justified, publicly performed, and utterly brutal. It took someone guilty of a property crime and subjected them to 3 days of calculated torture designed to maximize suffering while maintaining consciousness. It branded them, humiliated them, whipped them, mutilated them, and finally killed them, all while crowds watched and children learned that this was normal. This was justice. This was what civilization looked like in the 13th century. When you think about medieval England, don't just picture castles and knights and romantic tales. Picture William de Merton, stripped naked in a town square, his hand burning from a red-hot brand, knowing he has 2 more days of hell ahead of him. That's the medieval reality that history books often sanitize. That's the truth your teachers didn't want to tell you. That's what humanity was capable of, and in some ways, still is.